Michael Lewis is one of my favorite popular writers. He writes about sports, business, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, political campaigns, and now fatherhood. He's smart, he tells stories, and he has a sense of humor. Lewis was a trader at Salomon Brothers before he wrote his first bestseller, Liar's Poker, about the excesses of Wall Street during the 1980s. He continues to write about that world with a couple of books in 2008 and a column for Bloomberg. His newest book is about fatherhood, so we'll talk about that. But even more, we'll talk about Wall Street, the crash, and how we're dealing with it. Michael Lewis received a BA in art history from Princeton and a Master of Science in Economics from the London School of Economics. He worked, as I said, as an investment banker for Salomon Brothers before leaving to write Liar's Poker, which was a bestseller. Other books include Moneyball on the Oakland A's, Billy Beane, and baseball's new wave of Ivy League general managers, Panic, the story of modern financial insanity, and his newest, Home Game, an accidental guide to fatherhood. And as he's just told me before we went on the air, Moneyball, The Blind Side are both being made into movies, and Home Game into a TV sitcom. Michael Lewis is an industry unto himself. Welcome, Michael, again.
Thank you. It's a sad industry, but yes, it's a tiny little sad industry.
I'd like listeners to get to know the people behind the ideas that we deal with in the show, and you didn't set out to be a writer. So how did it happen?
I didn't write for school publications. It was when I was approaching graduation from college, from Princeton. It occurred to me I had to make a living doing something, and it really had not seriously crossed my mind that I was going to face the real world at some point. I always liked to write. I mean, I just always enjoyed it. It was the one thing I did. When I did it, I lost track of time. And so when I got out of college, I started to just submit sort of willy-nilly freelance magazine pieces, and it was very misguided. I didn't know what I was doing. I bought a book called The Writer's Market.
Oh, sure.
8,500 publications you could submit to, and someone should have told me better. But I was volunteering in a soup kitchen on the Bowery, and it was really wonderful material there. And I wrote a story about the soup kitchen, and I sent it to Delta and American and United Airlines in-flight magazines.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And I got these letters back saying, Mr. Lewis, we really appreciate the spirit in which you're operating here, but it's not really the material for the Delta in-flight magazine.
Yeah.
We keep on trucking, and I did this for a while through graduate school until I finally started getting published, and The Economist in London published my first pieces. And from the moment I was published, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I went off on this tangent and worked on Wall Street for Salomon Brothers for a couple of years. But even while I was there, I had a life as a freelance writer at night and on weekends. It got me into all kinds of trouble. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, essentially about how investment bankers were overpaid. And at the bottom it said Michael Lewis is an associate with Salomon Brothers in London, and it caused this crisis in the firm. And I got hauled into the fellow's office who ran Salomon Brothers International, and we hashed out. He said you can't write, and I said I got to write. I'm going to write. So what are we going to do? Do I have to leave He said, don't leave the firm. He said, can you write under another name? And we agreed that I would write under the name of Diana Bleecker, which was my mother's maiden name. And I functioned at Salomon Brothers in the name of Diana Bleecker for a couple of years until one day, Diana Bleecker got a phone call, and it was from.
I like where this story's going.
Diana Bleecker got a phone call from a fellow named Ned Chase, who is the actor Chevy Chase's father. And Ned Chase was an editor at Simon & Schuster. And he found out who I was. He'd seen some one of the pieces and offered me a book contract. And I didn't take that book contract, but from that moment I thought, why don't I write a book? Why don't I be doing this all the time? And I quit my job on Wall Street to write my first book about Wall Street.
Yeah, that's great. So Diane Bleecker got an offer.
Diana Bleecker got an offer. Diana Bleecker got an offer, but it was. Diana Bleecker had a very brief life, but it was a very interesting life because I was writing a lot about what was going on around me. And I would come in to the office. I come into the trading floor and see Diana Bleeker's article Xeroxed and passed around, and no one knew it was me. It was fun. It was fun, and every now and then I've played with pseudonyms. Pseudonyms are great. We just put some distance between you and it, but that was the most dramatic example of that.
Sure. As I said at the top, Michael, you've written about sports, bestsellers about sports, about finance. And how do you choose your subjects?
It's a very haphazard process. I've always thought that if you're going to interest a reader, you have to be interested yourself. And books especially are such a pain in the neck to do that if you don't have a real passion for what you're writing about, you're never going to get through it. And so it really is. It's what it starts. I mean, if you want to look at it kind of analytically, I have a little R&D lab, and the R&D lab is columns and magazine pieces, short pieces of work, where I can explore new ideas without having the commitment of a book. And at any given time, I have 15 or 20 ideas for little magazine pieces, and magazine editors who I'm dealing with, either Vanity Fair or the New York Times Magazine. Portfolio, which is now out of business.
Oh.
But yes, and that enables me to kind of paw around the subject for a bit. And if the subject, if it has the combination of a potential for a really great narrative, and which means characters I feel like I can make swing on the page, and some point to it that an intellectual depth to it.
You mean so that it can merit more time in an article?
Yeah. It sort of feel like when I get the feeling that if I write it as an article, I'm going to be disappointed because I'm going to have left all this stuff out. That's when I start to sense that this is a book, and but at first blush, I mean, it begs the question: how do things even start in the R&D lab? I mean, where do the magazine piece ideas come from? And that is really haphazard. That really is everything from something I heard at a dinner party to something I saw in the newspaper to just ideas kicking around my head.
And do you then? I'm imagining you have a number of places you write. You're successful, so then you go to New York Times and you say, I've got these 4 ideas. Which ones are you hot for?
So at the moment, I'm a contributing editor of Vanity Fair, and I have an editor there named Doug Stumpf, and Doug and I will talk every 2 or 3 days, and those conversations, sometimes which take place over a bottle of wine, are very free form, and in those conversations, the ideas come out, and sometimes they're my ideas, sometimes they're his ideas. So I wrote a long piece for Vanity Fair 2 or 3 months ago about the financial collapse in Iceland.
Yes, you did.
Would never have occurred to me to do it, but Doug actually called me out of the blue and said, I read some little thing in the Wall Street Journal about Iceland. It's so intriguing. Do you want to go and try to give it a whirl? And that was entirely from him. That wasn't my idea at all. More commonly, we're just talking about something, and it evolves into a piece.
Let's talk about the new book. I assume it grew out of a couple of things. First, the fact that you became and are a father, now of 3 children, and that you also did a column in Slate.
That's right. Now, this is a good example of how things come about, because it's pretty typical in a way. 2 weeks after my first child was born, Quinn, I was so perplexed by how different the experience of new fatherhood was from what I thought it was, that I felt something of an urge to start kind of keeping a record of it. But it wasn't really until 3 or 4 months later when people asked me how I was experiencing fatherhood, and I began to lie to them and make it and sanitize it and sentimentalize it, that I really got kind of angry with myself. And I said, look, this is crazy. That no one told me what this is like. I want to get it down on paper. So I started to keep a journal. And about the time, not long after that, I was in conversation with the editor of Slate magazine and Jacob Weisberg. And Jacob children are the same age as my children, and we were commiserating, and he and I was filled with self-pity and funny stories, and he said, why don't you just start writing about this for us? And so essentially what I did is I took extracts from the journal and published it over a period of 10 years. Right after a child was born, for a period of 6 and 9 months, I'd publish a handful of things on Slate. And that was it. They created a stir. People were either amused or upset, but there was no neutral response to them. They created a stir. And but I never reread them. I never thought of that there was any kind of potential for a book. I had a couple of offers to write books about fatherhood, but based on them, and I didn't really have any interest. I didn't want to write. I didn't.
So what changed?
Well, this is what happened. It was funny. About a year ago, someone sent my agent a handful of things from Slate, and he'd never seen them. My literary agent, and he and his wife were reading them in bed one night, and he found them very funny. And he called me and he said, how much of this is there? And I said, well, I kept a journal the whole time. And he then read the 40 or 50,000 words that I had, and that I still had not reread, and said, my God, this is a narrative, because you see you change, and the material is so rich. And so I finally said, all right, let me have a look at it. And I reread it. Now, when I reread it, I'd forgotten it all. You forget everything. That's why you reproduce a second time, is you forget what it was like the first time. If you didn't, memory is a great reproductive aid. Lack of memory, right? And so I was rereading this stuff, and this is immodest to say, but it is completely true. I was rolling around laughing. It wasn't me. It was like this other person had written this stuff, and it was all, it all came flooding back. But the material just seemed very fresh, even though some of it was written 10 years ago. And so I thought, what the hell? There's some shaping that needs to take place, but not much. I didn't cull any of the more monstrous sentiments that I'd expressed.
Okay, one thing I was going to say was, how closely did you stick to it? Pretty close.
Oh, I didn't change anything. It was more just cutting for narrative purposes, and I added another 10,000 words in the beginning and the end. But other than that, it was all just that. It was all. If I had touched it, I'd have screwed it up, because there were, I winced when I read some of it, but it was true at the time, and no one had told me these emotions exist when you're, right after a child has arrived in your life. So I thought, just leave it as it is. So I didn't fool with it very much.
Okay, one of the things I was going to talk to towards the end of the conversation, but I think I'm going to bring up now, because you've mentioned a couple times, that's a narrative, this is a narrative, and so on. I actually, when I'm not on the radio, I teach storytelling to nonprofits and foundations. So it's something that I'm very interested in. When people give me something and they say, is this a good story? I've realized I look for three things. So I'll throw you my three and then hear what you have to say. Are there flesh and blood characters? At least one. Mm-hmm. That means it's no longer a report. It's got something. Does something change? Mm-hmm. Something you mentioned as well. Is there something at the top that gets resolved at the end, or changed, or a important question answered? And then the thing I really love is, do you have scenes with dialogue?
Yes.
So
it is scene by scene construction is the sort of the scene. The scene is the building block of the narrative. There's no question. When I think of is it a story? I think a little bit more abstractly, though. I do think are there good scenes? Are there good characters? But I also think, is there movement? It's movement. And it's very hard to explain this. You just kind of feel it more than you can explain it. But as you're turning these pages, is the thing moving so that you really badly want to keep turning it? And you can get that. You can get movement in all sorts of ways. So Malcolm Gladwell, famous journalist, New Yorker writer, author of several books. You look at what he writes, and it isn't conventional narrative. the character tends to be an idea.
It's true. The leading character in most of his pieces
is an idea.
Yeah.
But he gives the idea movement, and you get a narrative. He turns an idea into a narrative. I think that's his great gift. I think is to give sort of an idea of the qualities of action.
Yeah.
And I also think in narrative that when it really gets clicking, and you're telling a really good story, that one of the key ingredients are absences or holes or places the reader can fill up themselves. It's almost I almost think that the test of a great story is which you can get away with leaving out, and it's that what you leave out is as important at least as what you put in, and so so that the reader has a kind of a space to occupy it. I mean, I think part of the way you get movement is by the reader becoming a kind of character in the thing that he's reading. There's got to be a place for that reader to go, and what I saw in Home Game, I mean, just as one example, but we can talk about any of the books. I can tell you what I thought I was doing. Whether I pulled it off or not, I don't know, but it was really clear that this character, it happened to be me,
right?
But I was detached from it at that point. The reader was going to have to decide whether this guy was a monster or an honest human being. And that there was a kind of...
So there was a role for the reader.
Absolute role for the reader. A kind of, and the role is morally judging me. And the holes in the narrative are all those times when I might have apologized for what I thought or what I said or what I did, and I don't. I just leave it as what this is, because this happened. It's up to you to sort of figure out how you feel about that, where you're going to take that. But the reader has to, that in a really great narrative, I think the reader is left with an awful lot of power to interpret the narrative. And what kills a narrative is the writer's desire to overdetermine the reader's experience.
I think that makes. I mean, I hadn't thought of it, but it really makes sense. In other words, so if the reader doesn't have a role to play, if you don't need the reader, if the reader isn't a teammate or an ally or I suppose even an adversary, perhaps, but then it's more passive, it's more finished. It's more
dictatorial, more of a lecture, more of an essay. And so these are subtle qualities of narrative. But to get back to your original question, there's no question that it's very hard to generate a decent narrative if the scenes aren't electric, if the characters aren't alive, if there isn't change or progress in a story or in a character. But there are these other qualities to it that I think are essential too.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I would say even just in my own experience, having written in the past, but then once I began teaching this and doing workshops where people write these 2-minute stories and then give them to me, that my understanding of what makes a story work evolves over time. My guess is that some of what you've just told me about holes and so on probably, you only realized years into what you're doing.
Yes, well, and often it's very late in the process. I'll have thoughts. The best thoughts I have are what I can pull out of it. I've written this thing, and I feel kind of okay about it. But if I can, it's like one of those. There's a game of building blocks where the game is to pull out a block without the tower falling. And the person who wins is the person who pulls out the last block you can pull out without the tower collapsing on itself. That the construction of the narrative is first building the tower and then pulling out the parts that you can pull out without the tower falling.
That's great. This is the first book where you're the main character, isn't it?
Not quite. I published a little book about my high school baseball coach.
I was going to say coach, but he's the main character.
He's the main character. I would argue that Liar's Poker, I'm the main character. And that was very much a memoir, but it was memoir it was work memoir,
Right.
that it never followed me outside the workplace because I just, I wasn't interesting outside the workplace. And I found is generally, I do insert myself occasionally, often actually, into stories I tell, but usually when I need myself for something. So I was in Moneyball, for example.
Yeah.
I was very trivially in it on the one hand. On the other, there were several places in that story where the reader needed the kind of the typical numbnut baseball fan to be present and asking the typical numbnut baseball fan questions. And as I was honestly that when I walked into the story, I served that role. I used myself. And even though, I think in a weird way, successful memoir, and this is what the home game is, no question, it's just straight, it's memoir. It's memoir of a very narrow experience, fatherhood. But where it succeeds not because the person is inherently interesting. It's more that you couldn't tell the story without yourself in it. That there is this great story, and it just so happens you need yourself to tell it. So even though it is about me, kind of, I don't regard it as about me. I regard it as about this experience, and the experience is common to humanity.
So what you're saying, actually, if someone were thinking, ooh, I want to write a memoir, your question would be, what's the story?
Yeah.
What's the story that needs to be written, that the people need to hear?
Right. In a way, you have to be incidental. And the problem, I think, the approach a lot of people have when they're writing in the first person is they're really just interested in themselves. They really just want someone to listen to them. And if people who are in a position of really wanting someone to listen to them, usually there's a reason they're not being listened to already. And so it's that's not always true, but often true. And so, I can't tell you how many times I've had people call me up or email me, especially Wall Street people, saying, "Oh, I read Liar's Poker. I've had this. What I went through is, so much worse and so much more interesting and so much more colorful." And they start to try to tell me about it. And what it really is they just want to talk about themselves, and there isn't actually some larger point to it. What interested me about this experience is, yes, it was me, but I was kind of outside me. That it was me, but it was more me. It just so happened I was the one who was having these children, and that it was the experience of having these children that was the material, and the emotional and physical and spiritual reaction to that I felt. Maybe my experience was not universal in the sense that everybody has their own experience, but there was a universal quality to it. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I was interested in it, not because I was terribly interested in me. I might be interested in me separately, but as a writer, I'm ruthless about this. Uh-huh. If I don't work, if I don't work on the page, I don't want me. Yeah. I don't need me. In this case, I needed me. Right.
Let me read, this is a quote from an interview, but obviously, this is you. Obviously, we're in the midst of some long, unhappy transition between the model of fatherhood as practiced by my father and some ideal model approved by all to be practiced with ease by the perfect fathers of the future. And we're in that transition period. So, first of all, the old model of your fathers, your experience in that transition, and the future.
Sure. My father's model was very simple. My mother did all the work. And my father saw me changing a diaper once, and he laughed at me, and he said, "What are you doing? I didn't talk to you till you were 21 years old." And he was joking, kind of.
Right.
And the first point to make about this is, even though that's true, that my father did none of the hard work of parenting, especially the first 15 years, first 12 years. It seems to have had absolutely no effect on the depth of his relationship with his children. He has very deep and rich paternal relations with his children. We adore him. My mother gets no extra credit for having done the work. She just did the work. We adore her too, but she doesn't get extra credit for it.
Right.
So
now, do you think that's part of because of the times?
Yes.
In other words, now someone would be looking at him.
That's right. Now you'd blame your father for not doing that. That's right. But he took full advantage of the deal that he had at the time. And he was surrounded by men who had the same deal. My parents are still very happily married. They both had rich and interesting lives. You can't look at it and say that was somehow inherently screwed up. It was just the way it was at the time. So I can't actually disapprove of anything they did. The world changes. America has this unbelievable ability to transform itself and transform social roles. So, and this is all to the good. There's no question that the deal my mother had was totally unfair and unjust in any kind of way. And so my wife has a different deal. But what that deal is curious because it's not as clear as, we now are 50-50.
Right.
I'm actually the same. I am the sole breadwinner as my father was the sole breadwinner. But in spite of that, I'm supposed to at least make a show of being really deeply involved in all of the dirty work, and especially right from the beginning, starting with her pregnancy and through the delivery room and when the baby's born and all that, that my socially assigned responsibilities are much more complicated. My father had none. I have a long list. But it's a little unclear what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And what makes it even muddier is that all around me, men have slightly different deals. So some have more Neanderthalish, 1950-ish like deals. Some have more seemingly evolved, 22nd century deals. But nevertheless, there's no standard.
Right.
And when there's no standard, just this fact is really unsettling. It's like there not being a fair price for a good in the marketplace. It's like it's that feeling you get when you walk into a Moroccan souk and you're seeing two rugs next to in stores, adjacent stores that are identical, and one costs $100 and the other costs $10,000. You don't know what the right price is, so you don't know. Not knowing what it is you're exactly supposed to be doing creates. And I'm telling you that even people who shake their head when this is said. They don't know the depth of anxiety it creates, because when you write about it, people get angry. When you talk about it, people get angry. If you have a dinner party with 5 couples and everybody's got a slightly different deal, and you start raising issues of who should do what in raising children, you are guaranteed a fight. You're guaranteed,
and probably some after people go home.
Unhappy dinner guests. It's like talking politics. It is politics. It's domestic politics. So there's this whole domestic political sphere that has opened up because the standard collapsed. And it is obviously not totally unexplored, but it's not something people spend a lot of time talking about because it causes such problems in their marriage. I can tell you how many radio hosts I've talked to in the last 3 weeks who, after the conversation was over, hit the mute button and said, "Man, if you knew what happened in my marriage, you think you had it bad," kind of thing. That, one after we were talking about the pros and cons of vasectomies and how I ended up having one after a long sort of propaganda campaign from my wife, and he hit the mute button. He said, "My wife scheduled my vasectomy from the delivery room table."
Wow. Wow.
But I would just say that so you have a very fraught subject. Never mind what you're supposed to do to raise the children and whether you're screwing them up or not screwing them up. What the collapse of standards has done just in marriages is interesting. Part of what I'm writing about is that it's the sort of domestic politics of new fatherhood.
Now we're going to switch to talking about Wall Street and what's going on in this country, and that has a lot to do with the fact that before he was the writer we know and the writer whose books we buy, he actually worked as an investment banker at Salomon Brothers and left that job and wrote Liar's Poker about the excesses of the 80s. I've heard you say that when you wrote Liar's Poker, you thought you were writing about the end of something.
Yeah, and I thought I was done with Wall Street. I thought that no one would believe 20 years from then that the insanity that took place on Wall Street, that no one would believe how much I got paid and why, that no one would believe that these firms behave so irresponsibly. And so I wanted to get it down on paper because I just assumed that history would muddle it rather than clarify it, and it would be nice to have a document of the experience there that people could go back to, and it was undeniable. Well, it turns out I was wrong, that it in some ways, Wall Street sanitized itself. So
How do you mean that?
Well, there was all kinds of bad behavior, surface bad behavior on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Incredibly sexist, incredibly rude, crude, socially unacceptable. Not much attention paid to just general social norms. All that got cleaned up. There was no place that was as colorful in 2007 as the Salomon Brothers trading floor was in 1987. Not on Wall Street. However, the cleaning up was a surface event. It was sanitized, but there was still an awful lot of financial profanity. That underneath the surface, the point of sanitizing it was to preserve the pay and to make it look okay, so that they could keep doing what they were doing, and which was taking ever more irresponsible risks with other people's money. I mean, that's a simple way of putting it, and building a system where everybody who was in it, basically, if you got them on their own and shook them by the shoulders, would acknowledge that their incentives were screwed up. That they were not incentivized, say, to produce long-term shareholder value for their firms. They were not incentivized to take intelligent risks. And
when you say, let me just jump on that one. When you say not incentivized to take intelligent risks, what you mean is that there wasn't that much penalty for losing, and the short-term gain for winning was out of sight.
Yes, you got paid an awful lot. Let's say if you're a trader in a Wall Street firm. Let's take a very concrete example. In 2005, and this thing comes along that's growing very fast, called the subprime mortgage bond market. And your firm is creating these subprime mortgages and packaging them up into bonds and selling them off at rapid rates. And the bonds are doing real well. There's a machine out there, and there's a market for these things. And you can borrow money cheaply as a trader and buy subprime mortgage bonds and make the spread between the two. Let's say you're a really smart guy, and you're sort of detached and intelligent about what's going on, and you see that this thing is totally irresponsible. The loans being made are likely to go bad. The lending standards are collapsing. The intelligent thing to do is not to buy subprime mortgage bonds, but to bet against them, to sell them short. You, as a trader inside a big Wall Street firm, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, would face a decision. Do I exercise my independent judgment and bet against this market, or do I just keep going along with what my firm is doing? If you exercise your independent judgment and bet against subprime mortgage bonds, you not only have probably run into some political conflict within your firm, but you never would have made money for yourself, because even when it all went, the moment you were right and it all went bad, your firm was doomed.
So selling short wouldn't even have worked.
It would not for you personally, because the minute that you made a bunch of money from your bet, your firm was so implicated in this, it was doomed. They couldn't pay you.
Right. So
the
one
smart thing to do was just to go along with it
Right.
and hope it just lasted long enough for you to get rich.
Yeah, because what I hear you saying is that one person, two people, three people doing the selling short, being wise even, would be dwarfed by the fact that the momentum, the bandwagon was so huge.
That's right. The firms were making huge sums of money from the fees of creating these deals, and there was all this risk associated with these deals, and that someone had to take, and they themselves took a lot of it just so they could earn the fees in the process. But let's back away from the financial system just generally and ask about incentives. These subprime mortgage bonds were rated AAA by Moody's and Standard & Poor. Why? Well, they could give you an argument. In retrospect, it looks like a very foolish argument. Even at the time,
it looks like worse than foolish to me.
It looks corrupt.
It looks corrupt.
Because they were paid by the people who issued the bonds to put the AAA rating on them. So that's a basic incentive problem. Their incentive is to please the people who are issuing the securities. They can't, at the same time, independently judge these securities if that's who they're getting their money from.
Let me ask you a question about that.
Right.
Just jump in right there. Arthur Andersen went out of business for doing the same thing with Enron.
Yes.
Basically, their accounting firms were supposed to look at the books of the companies they were the accounting firms of and audit them and so on, and they were being paid by those firms, so they fell.
Right.
And then we look, and a few years later, the same thing happens with the bond rating agencies. I guess the question is, how could someone, a regulator, a leader of a company, somebody, not see that we were recreating something which had been corrupt and had failed in a huge way?
Some people did see. Some people, that this crisis has dragged me back into Wall Street as a subject. My next book is that I'm working on now is a big narrative about this event, and the people I find most riveting are the people who saw it and could not believe the magnitude of the coming disaster. That they were briefly sane men in an insane world, and they would do things like call Standard & Poor and Moody's and say, "How are you rating these things? Our models show that if house prices even go flat, all these bonds you're saying are AAA will be worthless." And Standard & Poor would say to the question, what happens to these bonds if house prices go down? Standard & Poor's would say, we actually don't know because there is no place in our model to put a negative number. That the assumption is that house prices just keep going up. So when you think about corruption, there's the simple kind of corruption where I don't know, I give you $1,000 to interview me on the radio so it will promote my book. That's corrupt, and you know it's corrupt, and I know it's corrupt. But then there's a sort of different sort of corruption, and it is that we're all part of a system that is rewarding us very well and paying us to pay attention to certain things and not pay attention to other things. And we're not, in a way, we believe our own nonsense. We're paid to have blind spots in a way. And there's an awful lot of that kind of corruption embedded in the financial system because people's incentives are all screwed up. One more example. And this is something that has not come up at all in the plans to overhaul financial regulation. How can you possibly have a well-behaved Wall Street firm that is at once trading for its own books, owning securities, making bets on stocks and bonds for itself, that it is also selling to its customers? Inevitably, it will trade against its customers. It will deceive its customers for the sake of itself. There's no reason both those functions have to be inside one place. You could have firms like, say, Charles Schwab that provide financial advice but that don't take any positions in the securities. And then you could have firms like, Goldman Sachs, which isn't allowed to deal with customers but has its own trading accounts. And those functions should not be in the same place. It creates just endless problems.
And you're saying that in all the talk right now of reform, yes. and we're recording this interview on June 19th. So Obama and his administration and Geithner have put out their plans for new regulations. This isn't in there.
No, it's not in there. No one's even brought it up. What's even more amazing? The credit ratings agencies aren't in there. Their approach to the ratings agencies is not to say, we've got to, which they should say, is we've got to change who pays these people.
Of course.
Yes. And it should be illegal for issuers to pay raters for ratings.
Yeah.
It's a bribe. And instead what they say is we're going to give the regulators more authority to evaluate the ratings agencies. But that's not going to do anything. They already had that authority.
And the fact, as I say, that we saw it in accounting and then we see it in ratings mean, it's like face the reality.
I think, I haven't thought this through as clearly as maybe as I should have, but I do think that we have a deeper problem.
Can I throw you what I think the bigger problem is?
Sure.
And then throw it back.
And then I'll correct you?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So why don't you tell me? We may disagree.
I have looked at, I think, the three biggest crises of the last few years. The stock market crisis, the war in Iraq, and the new meltdown. And in each case, it looks to me there's an accountability crisis. That we talked about how the accounting firms didn't do. We have someone in place to play this role. They didn't do it in Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia. We have someone, as we said, in place to rate bonds and so on. Moody's, Standard & Poor's. They didn't do it. With the Iraq War, we had, to some extent, Congress in a role of making such a crucial decision. Their job is to play that role. The war in Iraq, to me, was done on a best-case scenario, which is another thing that fits in all of these, that people have undervalued risk and lacked accountability. So the Bush administration put it out on a best-case scenario, and people voted for it. Then they continued to fund it, and they continued to with supplemental appropriations. I asked someone, why? Why don't they ever say this is no longer an emergency? We're clearly in these wars. They should be part of the regular appropriations. They said, well, then Congress would have to make hard choices. Congress, if they didn't make it an emergency supplemental, would actually have to deal with it as part of the budget. They'd be stuck in a role of being accountable, and they don't want that. It looks to me like we've got a country, a society, a culture that has terrible ideas about risk and really has fallen down on accountability, and we're hurting everyone in the process.
All right. Do you mean to respond to that?
Yeah.
All right. Very creative bundling, Terry. Bundling the Iraq War with Enron and with the ratings agencies. I would put the Iraq War to one side for a moment. Because if you look at the other two cases you mentioned, yes, there was someone in place. There was Arthur Andersen in place to examine Enron. There was the credit ratings agencies were meant to be examining these bonds. In both cases, they had the incentive to exercise bad judgment. They had the incentive to queer their judgment because they were being paid by the wrong people. The rules of the game were totally screwed up. And then you back away from it. So why are the rules of the game totally screwed up? And this is the deeper problem, I think. And I think it goes back to the days of liar's poker, that our economy in the last 25 years has created this beast, the financial industry, that is much too big, that is doing lots of things that have nothing to do with productive enterprise, in which the rewards are so outlandish it has distorted the upper tier of the income structure, so that
the very rich people.
The reason CEOs get paid as much as they do is that Wall Street taught them how to do it. That Wall Street people there's been this creeping, egregious level of pay in the
we're 100 million, 500 million.
It's all kind of the same.
Yeah.
It's just you get a huge sum of money for doing something that, if you back away from it, is maybe actually socially, economically counterproductive. Right. People made fortunes out of the subprime mortgage bond market. That's insane. So you have this, our economy, our society has created this kind of very strange economic value system, and where really smart people, the leadership class, thinks it's the done thing to go to Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley and get paid $3 or $4 million a year, even though you don't actually add value in any way, and it's in the air we breathe. Let
me just throw a number, which I'll bet you're aware of, but in 1970, only about 5% of men graduating from Harvard went into finance. 5% in 1970. By 1990, 15%. Yeah, by 15%. And by the class of 2007, 20% of the men and 10% of the women plan to go into investment banking.
And half of the other ones applied and just didn't get jobs. And so this is a really radical misallocation of human talent. And it's caused by a sort of, I mean, you could say it's because faith in the free markets, but it's sort of like whatever the market generated, it is okay. But it's caused by this a culture of financial manipulation that has grown up and is just thought normal now.
And I would think one little piece in here is that we heard people 20 years ago saying, America used to be a manufacturer, we used to make things, and now we do services. And when people thought of services, they thought of fast food, they thought of restaurants, they thought of lawyers and so on. No one, I don't think, until this last bubble burst, really saw that what we had called services, a huge part of it was the financial sector.
That's right. And let me just draw an analogy. What happened in the big Wall Street firms with the subprime mortgage bond racket was that this business gets created, the subprime mortgage bond business. It's very profitable, source of lots of fees. The people who create the business within each firm acquire, because they're generating the money for the firm, enormous power over the firm, so that when the business gets decreasingly sane, when the loans get shakier and shakier,
and the leverage gets
bigger and bigger, they're the ones who say, we got to keep doing this, even though outsiders, people who weren't directly implicated in the business, might have said, no, stop. But because they're generating so much money for their firms, they have enormous influence.
So you're saying there might have been people within the firm even who said...
Every firm had people who
were the sane, the conservative.
Yes, who got driven out.
And they weren't earning as much money for the company?
Right.
It was, who cares what you think?
So the analogy I want to draw is between that, what happens inside Merrill Lynch, and what happens inside the United States. Here we have our little company, the United States of America. For 30 years, the people who have made the most money and have had the most money to throw around are people who are engaged in the financial manipulation. And they have outsized influence over the way the company is run.
The company being the United States,
right.
being the government.
That's right. And so we are now at a place, we should be at a point right now where we are radically reforming the financial system. And no one who's got an actual interest, no Wall Street person, is having a great deal of influence on how that reform goes. Instead, the Obama administration is sort of half-heartedly reforming the financial system, not actually making much in the way of no radical change, in fact. And Wall Street people are instrumental in designing the new rules. And I think they think it's going to work. I think they think that nobody's going to say anything to them about it. But I think it's politically risky. I think there's a real chance that there's going to be an uprising about this, that they're going to have trouble controlling the process.
Well, do you mean they'll face trouble in the next few months trying to get something passed, or when the effects of the fact that what they did won't work?
Right. It won't work, and at the same time, the mess they created is going to have slow-burning economic consequences.
You mean the mess of the solutions?
The solutions and the problem.
Yeah.
That we're going to be living in a very soft, weak economy for a long time that's going to create disillusionment and anger. And what I expect is going to happen is that there's going to be a crashing down of Wall Street's influence. It's amazing it hasn't happened yet, but it hasn't happened yet.
No,
and it hasn't happened yet because for 30 years, their influence, the influence has just become part of the air we breathe.
But, yeah, that's what I was going to say. It doesn't look like in this case, it's specifically financial contributions to political candidates, although there certainly is plenty of that. But it's that
It's worse than that.
The best and the brightest
want to go work on Wall Street. That's the out. If you're in Washington right now and you are engaged in public policy around Wall Street, if you're a regulator at the SEC, if you are at the Federal Reserve, if you are in the U.S. Treasury, and you're thinking, what do I do next after I stop doing my poorly paying public service job? There is an out. There's an out from you get paid millions of dollars a year to go work at Goldman Sachs, and I don't think the people who are engaged in trying to fix the problem are necessarily totally conscious of this, of how corrupt it all is, but it's just sort of it's in the air they breathe. That the existing institutional structure rewards the people who are making the decisions. So they don't want to change it. They can't imagine a different institutional structure. They can't imagine a completely tamed financial sector that actually is there just to serve the productive economy.
Right. As I had here a question here. The people who've made decisions so far have not been asking this question: how do we save the folks? It's how do we save the banks? They always stop short of how do we save this little community? How do we save these people? How do we save this school?
The premise of the bailouts has been extraordinary because first it was how do we save the banks, and it wasn't even. And there are lots of banks. Not all of them were involved in the subprime mortgage.
Most of them were.
If you're going to start giving money to banks, you would think you'd give it to the bankers who didn't do the dumb things. But instead, the money goes to the bankers who did do dumb things because they're the ones who are about to go out of business. All right, but then what's even more interesting is both the Bush and the Obama administrations, their starting point for dealing with this problem was to say, one, we can't nationalize these banks. And two, the creditors of these banks can't take any sort of haircut. They can't take any
for
losses.
Making these terrible investments.
Yes, no. So it leaves you as a matter of public policy with only one solution, and that is to give money to the banks until they quote unquote earn their way out of it. And so the Congress wrote a check for $700 billion 6 or 7 months ago, and then Congress lost the appetite for giving money to the banks. So what's going on right now is the banks are being gifted money kind of sneakily in the form of zero interest rate loans from the Federal Reserve, which they can then reinvest in government securities and keep the spread and continuing to run their high leverage. But it's essentially huge public subsidies going into these institutions. And you back away from that and you say, what kind of society is this where you have socialism for bankers and capitalism for everybody else? So capitalism for everybody but the capitalists. That's not sustainable. And to the extent that there is a growing awareness of what's going on, and I think that people just generally don't completely understand what's going on. But I do think it's a political issue.
That this problem is taking place at a level that people sort of go, it's above me.
It's above me, and they must know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But the fact is, they haven't known what they were doing. I mean, there's no reason to suspect they know what they're doing now. And they're trying, I guess, but there's this double standard and this notion that with the banks and with these institutions in which people are paid egregious sums of money, that in these places alone, the profits are for private. The profits are privatized. The losses are socialized. That's a disaster, I think, and that they have not taken a more punitive approach to Wall Street amazes me. But I think they're going to be forced to. I think that the Obama administration is going to be forced to.
So you see this, a year out, 2 years out?
A couple of years out. This is what if I had to guess what's happening, what I guess is happening is that Obama looked at the problem. He said, if I do what actually needed to be done right now, it would consume the first 2 years of my administration. That I would be spending all my time. I could get one thing done, and that would be radical reform of the financial industry. I wouldn't get health care. I wouldn't get anything else. So I'm going to delay that problem and put a Band-Aid on it and do the other things I want to do, and we'll come back to it. That's the only...
And by the way, I think you're giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Well, maybe. I think he deserves the benefit of a lot of doubt.
Yeah.
He's earned it with me. So that's the only thing I can think. And so,
but
that means,
you do see a new day of reckoning.
Yes, I do.
And the question, I mean, when I talk to some people, the question is, will people, will society get really ugly before that happens?
Yeah, that's the problem.
The hate crimes we've seen recently are the tip of the extreme of that.
If you accept that what caused the financial crisis are totally screwed up rules of the road, the rules of the game are screwed up. The incentive, people are given the wrong incentives, and when you go about reforming it, you don't change those rules. You're just going to get the same problem all over again. So I think that's the issue. I think eventually we're going to have to change the rules of the game.
Yeah. Okay, we got to end it there. Again, Michael Lewis's new book is Home Game: An Accidental Guide to Fatherhood. His next book is going to be about Wall Street, and there'll be articles, I'm sure, in Vanity Fair, New York Times, wherever in the interim. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others at any time during the week by linking to our podcast. You can also sign up to have it delivered to you weekly for podcasts, articles, transcripts, and to get my weekly announcement telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about via email. Email me at temcnally@mac.com, temcnally@mac.com, temcnally@mac.com. Let me know what you want. Thank you, Michael Lewis. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.